Hello and welcome to episode number 4 of this podcast. My name is Elliot Greenman and I host it alongside my friend Alexia Nell. We recorded this at the end of April 2019, just after the London Marathon. So we talk a bit about exercise, I guess people's motivation for doing exercise, nutrition, stress, IBS, and then we go into accountability, responsibility again, and kind of talking about mental health and the link there with stress. And then we talk a little bit about beliefs and what those beliefs might be stopping you from believing in. And then we end on the 4 agreements. As always, if you want to like, share, comment, then please do and enjoy.
Perambulations in franglais. Well done, Elliot, for finishing the London Marathon in good time as well. Under 6 hours this time around.
Yeah. My friend bet that
less than 4 hours, but not bad.
My friend bet that I was going to do it in 6 hours and 6 minutes, and I had to point out to him that it's like a quick walk.
In 6 hours and 6 minutes? Is it? Yeah.
Well.
Yeah.
26 divided by 6 is like 4 and a bit. So it's, you got to go 4.5 miles an hour.
4 miles. Oh yeah, okay.
Basically.
Yeah. So and Mo did it. The guy, the first one, did it in just over 2 hours or something.
2 hours and I think 2 or 3 minutes.
That's it.
Set the new course record.
Yeah, that's it. And it didn't look like he had been sweating too much.
Yeah.
It
was perfect conditions.
Yeah.
Well, it's like 14 degrees overcast.
That's it. Not too bad really. Rather than 66 degree. No. Well done. No, it's interesting really to see why people do it really, and then asking yourself a bit the question when you're running around like that. I think it's quite an interesting thing really. Like the whole group thing, couple of friends like that. My colleague last year woke up on the 1st of January and he was like, oh yeah, I'm going to do the Paris Marathon. I'm 25, I play football, it should be fine. And after 7 weeks of training, he buggered his knee, something like that. And I've had Debbie as well, a friend of ours, and she really almost damaged her knee permanently, really, on the training leading up. But bizarrely, she was doing park run, she was doing a couple of bits and bobs, really. So when I talk to people who do quite a lot of, I treat quite a few people who do Ironman and marathon and things like that, and I think it's quite interesting to see really how people get you need to get your body ready to do the whole thing really.
Yeah, because I remember talking to you about doing the London Marathon last year, and I said, how long would you say you need to prepare your body to run the marathon? And you said minimum a year.
Yeah.
And even then, that's for you just to be able to complete it, not
do it.
Time.
Yeah, that's it. And I think 3 years is really like if you really belong to a running club or something like that. I think it's quite good.
Because as soon as you start going over a certain distance, I think as soon as for me, if I go over 6 miles.
Yeah.
I know, like, everything starts to come to surface. Like lots and lots of issues come around quite quickly.
That's it.
And it's not as if we cover a huge amount of land or distance on our feet nowadays, is it?
That's it. No. And then I guess that's the whole a bit the problem about being sedentary a little bit, and all the metabolic disorders, being overweight and all those kind of things is quite big. It's quite important thing really. We are sat on our asses quite a lot really, and we go from the office in the car sat, and then we go from the car to the house sat, and then all the rest I think is quite diabolical really.
But and even being sat, so like I would say a lot of people, especially that I know or work with and stuff, they don't do any thing physical. So no exercise, no stretching.
Yes, that's it.
And even just learning how being in a seating position for long periods of time, so 9 to 5 or whatever. I'm sat in a seating position pretty much solidly for 8 to 9 hours a day.
Yeah, that's it.
And like the way your body's going to accommodate that with the shortening and stuff, it's quite interesting to see that.
And to see a little bit like that hip and shoulder pattern a little bit, and the upper triangle cross syndrome, all those bits and bobs really. And I think a bit more yoga, a bit more stretching, hydration, because that's as much as like we talk about the pain gate quite a lot, about all those kind of stuff, and we talk about the skin and the central nervous and peripheral nervous system, but we talk about the muscle and the joint and the fascia, the connective tissue, and we talk about the gut really. And I guess a lot of what's happening with when you walk and you do mild exercise is that you actually breathe and you massage your gut in a way really, so you got a bit better hydration from your large intestine, your kidney is being ballotted a bit better, so it's really kind of propping things up really in a way really. So there is as much a muscular part of it and the whole musculoskeletal fitness, but you got your organ fitness as well, and your diaphragm really, and the cadence you have a little bit does quite a lot really. Yeah, when you do mild exercise, because by the time you do marathon distances, I think the first person who ran the marathon died. So for the battle of marathon, to give the good news of the victor, and then I think he didn't. Mind you, he was with his
He'd just done the battle.
His armor, his shield, his sword, his helmet,
and had probably been in battle as well.
So anyway, but yeah, I think it's quite interesting.
But my gut, my like intestines now on the right hand side is really. This I know it for sure, and it hurt on the way around.
Well done for doing the rehydration salts a little bit.
Yeah.
I think it's quite great stuff like that. Couple of days after it. And
well, I only had to lick.
Lick
your skin to know
how much salt you had lost really. That's it really.
Yeah.
So your volemia, your blood volume is really managed by the large intestine basically. Volemia, yeah.
What does that mean?
Your blood volume.
Volemia,
is managed by your large intestine. So everything you're gonna cry, dribble, snot, piss, sweat and breathe, it needs to come back in. So all like your saliva, your tears, your sweat are just filtrates of your blood. Like your urine is a filtrate of your blood, basically. Okay, which enables the whole body to excrete quite a lot of toxicity from the body. Really.
In lots of different ways.
In lots of different ways. So yes, of course, the sweat has got another thermoregulation type thing, because like fluid on your skin is gonna actually evaporate, and then it keeps your skin temperature.
They have other uses other than just getting rid of toxins.
That's it. Yeah. So that's I can't remember in English too much acrine and paracrine glands like that. So we got like sweat glands on our armpit, in the back of the knee, in the inside of the elbows, and in the groin a little bit, which are a little bit more getting rid of toxins basically. And then the ones a bit elsewhere tend to really be a bit more for thermoregulation in a way. But yeah, all the salts and things like that go away really.
Yeah, and I think dehydration in general is like, the more I've been thinking about how much I drink, but also what, the other minerals, the micronutrients and stuff that you get through like water or hydration tablets with salts and stuff.
That's it.
And it's helped me so much just by being, as soon as I am on top with drinking a lot and making sure I'm hydrated and drinking a little bit less alcohol, I feel so much better.
Yeah, because alcohol is interesting. One molecule of alcohol or ethanol to go into your bloodstream, you need to eject 2 molecules of water. 1 molecule of glucose to get in your system needs to expel 1 molecule of water.
One molecule of glucose to get into your system has to expel one
molecule of water.
So even
and then ethanol, I think it's what is that, but I think the ethanol is 2 for sure. Maybe the glucose is not water mediated, but I think it is. I thought it was. So we tend to dehydrate a little bit with those kind of things.
When eating sugar as well?
Yeah, potentially, yeah. So, it's interesting, all that thing. And then I think we talk about sedentary people don't tend to hydrate enough, really. That's the main thing, really. And again, hydration is great for concentration, is great for all sorts of dilution of waste product, all those kind of stuff. It helps with the diuresis a little bit with your kidney, flushing everything, and it actually keeps your stool loose a little bit as well, really, in a way. So there's less constipation and things like that. Quite a lot of people are constipated because they actually don't drink enough water, really. And we talk about 2 liters of water already. So
that's a lot.
Well, it's 4 pint of water already.
When you think about, I think when I looked into how much I was, or when I actually noted down how much I was drinking. It was very, very
how much water you are drinking? Because that's the thing, really. If you drink coffee, that's dehydrating a little. If you drink alcohol, it's dehydrating. Certain molecules that you eat tend to get rid of water as well. So you need to kind of balance that, really. So you go out, you have a few drinks and things. You can have a glass of water in between every glass of red wine or something like that, and it actually helps quite a lot, really.
And hydrating quite a lot beforehand, then obviously after.
Before, after, and things like that, really. Providing that your gut is not too inflamed, providing that your gut functions properly, providing that you move enough, all those kind of stuff. There's quite a lot of things, really. So if you're celiac and you've had some gluten and things like that, or some wheat related type of product, your gut is going to be quite inflamed, and then your rehydration pattern is not going to be very good, really. In a way, really, because you're quite inflamed and your gut is the lining of your gut is quite inflamed, really. So the exchange of fluid is not going to be done very, very easily, really. You might actually ooze more fluid from inflammation, really, in that area.
Well, because it's not able to get through the intestinal wall properly.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
So we see that quite a lot with people who've got acne, for example, and things like that. Well, they've got excess waste product a little bit, and their skin is enabling the whole lot to actually breathe a bit more and things like that, really. This big thing in New Zealand at the moment with we were talking about mass industry in terms of cows and sheep and poultry and all those kind of things. There used to be loads of sheep in New Zealand, and now there's lots of cows, which are actually very different type of grazing and the way the whole thing is done in terms of the farming, and a lot of the butter and the milk and the cheese from New Zealand tends to go to China, and Chinese people tend to be lactose intolerant. 90% of Chinese people are lactose intolerant.
Is that because they weren't brought up with cows and they weren't brought up?
No, just genetically speaking, in their genome, the once winded, I think it's or wind. Weaned, like when the baby stop breastfeeding.
Weaned.
Weaned.
That's it.
Weaned. Yeah, that's it. Once weaned, the whole baby, or the process of weaning actually is when the lactase enzyme gene tends to switch off. And that's what triggers a bit the baby to actually not want too much breast milk, really. But 90% of Chinese hands people are hands, H-A-N-A-S, hands are lactose intolerant, so they don't have lactase enzyme as an adult.
Yeah,
I think European is 10% of Europeans are lactose intolerant. So, and I think it's from that interglacial area, or just at the time of sedentarization and farming and thing. And we did have all those animals back in our midst a little bit, and then he gave the people who could digest better those kind of product had an advantage of actually being able to survive a bit longer, really.
What if they're able to digest
Milk.
meat?
Yeah, milk. That's it. I think they even an interesting thing about the Mughals and Attila and how successful the Mughal Empire was because of the milk from their horses. And actually, they had a genetic difference compared to the Huns, which was to actually be able to digest lactose. And actually, that it meant that you had a mare who could produce some milk, and then you had your dinner ready. So you had like protein, you had hydration, you had the sugars, all those kind of stuff, the fat, all the rest, which actually meant that they were quite lean people, but they were quite well fed, really. Compared to an army like that, you could actually go on horseback, and then you could digest the whole byproduct of the horse, really. And therefore, you didn't have to transport it and things like that. So compared to the Chinese, they had to actually get wheat or rice, and they had to get grain and thing, and all the malarkey behind it, and the cooking of it, all those kind of stuff, really. And that was actually far a big advantage for the whole spread of the Mughal Empire was actually the fact that they were not lactose intolerant mostly.
Where's the Mughal Empire from? Is that
Attila and from Central Asia?
Okay.
Central Asia, yeah. I think they came all the way to the door of the Ottoman Empire. I think they might even almost ended up in Hungary and places like that, really. So they were like, I think there was really big extent from the Chinese Great Wall type thing all the way to Europe, almost, or to Turkey or Eastern Europe.
Yeah, it's a long way.
Long way.
Why does 90% of Chinese why have they?
That's just like that. It's just genetically speaking, they don't digest lactose basically.
Their lactase enzyme turns off when they need to stop.
That's it. Weaning.
Breastfeeding.
Yeah, breastfeeding.
That's really interesting.
90%. So I think in Europe, 90% of babies have got the lactase, or 10% of babies don't have lactase enzyme. So that's a bit the tricky thing in my practice when I see babies who are a little bit colicky or they fail to thrive, they are quite irritable, all those kind of stuff. That's something to really think about if the treatment doesn't really work very well from what we are doing osteopathically. Maybe they've got a little bit of a problem with the digestion of milk, basically. But 90% of babies digest the milk very well. It might be even more. I'm not entirely sure. But as Europeans, we tend to really keep the ability to digest lactose throughout life, basically, as Europeans. So like 9 out of 10 adults really definitely carry on digesting lactose throughout life, really. Compared to Chinese, I think there's only 1 in 10 Chinese who can digest lactose.
Yeah, that's crazy. So
they're being fed because there's so many of them. There's 1,400 million of them. They need to be fed, and we need to eat up their protein and their food consumption. The amount of calories,
nutrient consumption
that they are getting, but they're getting it from cheese, from butter, from milk,
fish,
which tends to actually really be a problem. Who comes from New Zealand, so New Zealand gets actually buggered, and the environment and the farming environment gets buggered in order to give that to Chinese people mostly and export it to China, which actually can't really digest the whole product, really. So it's really quite a weird thing. And I guess you would see that quite a lot on Chinese students. Their skin is not very good. They've got quite bad acne, all those kind of stuff at that time of the life, and they come to Europe and they change their diet quite a lot, really.
And that's why they have bad
skin.
Yeah, because they're just not used to.
They're not used to the whole lot.
That, alongside maybe a bit of stress,
inflammatory type process in the gut and all those kind of stuff, and the skin takes over to actually expel some of the toxins. Or naturopathically speaking. But I might be proven wrong. Somebody might be able to comment on that and say, no, it's completely bollocks, something like that.
It's like nutrition's so unbelievably ridiculous because Jordan Peterson just sent out a tweet today that I saw saying that he got his blood results back from 3 independent insurance companies. Yeah. They did they did full blood work on him.
Yeah.
And everything is absolutely spot on. And that's after 1 year of only eating beef. Only.
Yeah.
The only thing he does with the beef is cooking it in tallow, which is beef fat.
Yeah.
And nothing else. Absolutely nothing else.
Yeah.
And he says all of his autoimmune issues have gone.
Yeah.
His blood work's absolutely perfect, including vitamins and all the things that people said that wouldn't be perfect because you don't get vitamins in meat.
That's it.
But it's like, obviously our understanding, there's no scurvy, which is what everyone was taking the mick out of him for, because they were like, you're not getting any vitamin C.
That's it.
And it's like, and him and his daughter are on the carnivore diet, and I think his daughter does recommend it actually, but he's like, I'm not saying anything because I'm not a nutritionist, but all I know is that it is working for him. That's
it.
But
we know that quite a lot of the needs need to be met, and therefore you go on some kind of diet, or if you call it a diet, you can call it a lifestyle change, you can call it whatever you want to call it in order to not to call it a diet, because people who go on a diet tend to be stressed.
Yeah,
because they have to achieve something, and then they tend to maybe use certain foods as a emotional crutch in order, and therefore they know they've been told you can't have that, you can't have it. Like some colleagues of mine do allergy testing, and it's a complete loads of.
But that's
like it's shenanigan basically, and even if it was quite interesting. Do you really want to know what you can't eat?
Well,
is it really useful to know what you can't eat?
I just had one of those skin prick tests.
Yeah.
And so they give you like a control of histamine, and then they give blah blah blah. And the dog hair one came up massive.
Yeah.
And I was like, whenever I go and like spend some time with a new dog.
Yeah.
I do generally get like a little bit of something, but it's not massive, and it's certainly not worse than when I'm in a field with like newly cut grass, which is supposedly one of the ones that they did.
Yeah.
But then I was like, I've been asked recently by someone to what tests I would recommend for them to get for food allergies for IBS, and I recommended the first thing to do is get a cortisol test instead, because I was like, your allergies or your tolerance to absolutely everything and your nutrition and blah 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 is directly related and massively affected by your stress levels. So there's actually no point at all having one before you've realised
how stressed you are. And IBS is a sign of stress, indeed. Really.
Yeah.
Like it's a symptomatic result or a symptom of stress, really. But what I was really going into, and I think it's great to have like a skin prick type test in order to look at different allergens and things like that, really. But food intolerance testing and getting a result, however accurate the whole thing is, getting a result about what is it you cannot eat, how interesting is that? That's the whole thing, really. You see somebody who's got a little problem and is really a bit worried about the whole lot, and you go and seek a professional help, and somebody is telling you what you can't eat, which is on it maybe really mentioning to people what they can eat and how they can eat it. I think that would be a bit more helpful. Really.
What to say? You can eat this. You can eat this.
Yeah, but then, rather than talking about what you can't eat. Oh, you can't have strawberries in the morning without peeling the whole lot. You can have spots on your bum. Yeah. Like that's the whole thing a little bit. I think it's a lot about. I wanted to work with a nutritionist not too long ago, a couple of years back, and I contacted local nutritionists, and there was one lady who unfortunately had other arrangements and other things going on, but it was really interesting. She was doing actually like a 6 or 10 week kind of diet, eating habit, cookery type classes. So you had the weekly meeting, and you meet with other people who, for example, you wanted to lose weight, but you'll have people who had high blood pressure, or wanted to get rid of their triglycerides, or some people who were diabetic, type 2 diabetic, all those kind of things. So there was different, or people who were actually sporty and they wanted to change a bit the whole way they were actually eating. And she was doing cookery classes with all of them, and you had like an introduction about what sugar, protein, and lipids were on about, and then you had like different ways of cooking, with steaming, with frying, with baking, with oven work, all the rest and thing. And she was really going through all of that with everybody. And everybody could actually contribute to the table, to say about recipes, all those kind of stuff, because it's not really the food it's not the. So I think in French we would talk about like the raw material of your diet. So we talk about protein, grains, we talk about dairy products, we talk about all those kind of stuff, which is great. But actually, you need to process them. You need to. So after the paleo diet and all the different things, is or raw food diet or juicing diet, it's more the way the stuff is processed and the way it's cooked. Because it's all about cooking habits, really. Okay, so if you still have your pans, if you still have frying pans, and you still got an oven and all those kind of stuff, and you're gonna carry on doing the shepherd's pie that your auntie Mathilde he was cooking, and it's the best one in the world, and things like that, really. But Uncle Bob died of clogged up arteries. He was 47, really. You know. In a way, really, and then we don't talk too much about that, but it's the best shepherd's pie, and it's like bloody August, and it's 30 degrees outside, and you're having a shepherd's pie type thing. So it's all the emotional link to food, it's the way it's prepared, it's the way it's cooked, it's the cookery techniques you have, all those kind of stuff, really. That should be quite interesting. So a lot of things you do shakes type thing, and you do food supplements or meal replacement, all those kind of stuff. That works really well, really. But and then you lose some weight because one, you decrease your energy intake, your calorific intake. Calorie intake goes completely down. You tend to hydrate a bit more because you drink quite a fair bit, and that thing. And then all of a sudden, what do you do when you finish all your sachets? You go back to eating the same things that you were eating before. That's the whole thing, really. So how is it you alter the whole lot? By being told what not to eat, or by being told what is it you can eat and how is it you can eat?
But for
really, a little bit, really.
So that's the whole thing. That's the same thing as like being a manual therapist and someone coming to see you and then being like, oh yeah, that must really hurt because it's really bad, and it's like focusing on the wrong side of things, instead of leading them being like, oh, okay, so here's the solution. It's like, oh, that must be really bad. So nutritionists, instead of them being like, oh, you can't eat this because it's really bad, it's like, here's a direction to go in. But I think most people, like from personal experience with people who want to lose weight, I think most of them, a lot of people don't actually cook badly, or at least they don't tell me that they're cooking badly. But they need to know if they're intolerant to bread, for example, or if they're intolerant to. They need to know some of the foods that they are actually intolerant.
So exclusion diet.
That's
it. Yeah. So you eat the same than you do usually. You don't alter anything apart from that one food that you take away from the whole lot. You look whether you're still bloated, whether you shit sideways still, all the rest and thing, really. And that's quite an interesting type way of doing that.
But it takes a long time.
It takes a long time because
a lot of dedication.
Sometimes it's the type of bread. We're lucky in Tetbury, we've got a great baker or a great bakery, and the way the bread is actually processed and done, and the fermentation is done, and those kind of stuff. It's really slowly done, and actually it's quite a good quality flour, and it's quite a good quality process it's a quite wholesome type thing. And then even when I eat the white bread from there, well, in reasonable quantities, I'm not too bothered really. If I go in the supermarket and thing, it feels like my breakfast is if I have 2 toasts of the whole lot, it feels like my breakfast is carrying on finishing the whole bloody fermentation in my gut. It's I mean really, it's just it's a very different stuff. So after there's a bit of yeast, there's quite a few bits and bobs, but the ingredients and the way it's done, and sourdoughs and soda breads, all those kind of stuff can be quite an interesting thing, because often you think you're a bit intolerant to the whole bread, but actually which part of the bread, because there's a couple of...
And what type of bread?
There's a couple of type of thing in the bread as well, because there's all the yeast, and quite a lot of people, we talk about antibiotics, and we talk about loads of stuff, so people's flora is completely buggered, and we've got a 3.2 billion year warfare that is at play between yeast and bacteria. The penicillin comes from yeast, and is to actually deal with bacteria.
And that's happening in our...
That's happening in our gut day in, day out, really, you know? So we were talking about... Did we talk about food transplants?
Yeah,
couple of times before, really, and so it's really quite an interesting thing, really. Like people who've had Clostridium difficile or MRSA, Clostridium difficile. Like it's one of the nosocomial infection in hospitals, and you get really poorly, you get dehydrated quite a lot, and some people give poo samples, healthy poo samples which are cultivated, and people have a nasogastric probe, and then we inject it into their gut from the top down, and it repopulates all the whole lot, and it competes with Clostridium basically, because otherwise you get antibiotics to try to destroy the whole lot, and it destroys
and just feeds it.
When it doesn't, when it feeds the yeast, the antibiotics is going to feed the yeast, but the main problem is Clostridium is quite resistant to antibiotics, so it takes quite a lot of it to get rid of it, and but all the other bacteria in your flora get wiped much faster really, and therefore there's no competition really.
Because it's about the ratio as well, isn't it?
It's about the ratio
of bacteria,
of type of bacteria and things like that really. So all that
so crazy.
It's crazy. And then I think we come to, there's lots of research about all those kind of stuff, and there's a submucosal and a myenteric plexus. So we talked about how many neurons there are in the gut, and there's as many neurons in your gut than there is in your spinal cord. So it's quite a lot really, okay? But you've got submucosal plexus, so you've got your lumen, which is like the hollow in your gut, which is the outside world, and then you get your mucosa, which is the first layer of cells which actually interact between the outside world and your internal world, and then you've got loads of bacteria, loads of immune cells, loads of neurons, loads of very interesting processes at play there, and it enables the interaction and the transfer and the absorption of certain macronutrients, like all those kind of things really, and it's really linked to your immune system and our food lot really, you know. You eat a bad shellfish, your body doesn't take too long to pick up these bacteria, and the byproduct of metabolism from those bacteria is a big signal, and you're gonna puke I've had a shellfish intoxication when I was in Portugal 2 days ago, and saying, you eat bad paella with a bad thing, you shit it and you puke it in like 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Your body is really, with those kind of stuff, it goes,
gets it out very quick,
really quickly, and it's all the whole sensory type of thing, and the outside world, I think it's really superbly put together, really.
Yeah,
put together. No, so it becomes very, very interesting, really, and the cortisol test might be quite an interesting thing to understand your level of stress, really. But it's a bit of a pitfall again, really, because we know about the expectation fulfillment theory of dream, we know about food intolerance, we know about environmental stress, we know about all those kind of stuff really. So all of a sudden you need to assess a little, you need to plan the whole thing again really. So yes, your cortisol level is not up to scratch. You don't have, it's on the 94th percentile or 97th percentile, so you got 3% less cortisol than you should, all those kind of stuff. And it's just like that ongoing stress, but which stress is involved really? Because we know that emotional stress is going to actually lead.
All that's doing, if you got a cortisol test, is confirming that you are stressed.
That's it.
But
for means that you are the stresses have led to you having a physiological an exhaustion of your adrenal gland.
Yeah. So the stress, which most people would consider as like, it's really funny because if I talk to my mum about stress, or if I talk to some other few other people, like my nan as well, and she'll be like, I'm not stressed, I'm not a stressy person, and I'm like, it's so funny how everyone's idea of stress is like in one particular way, almost like they're uptight and gonna snap any minute. But it's actually worse the other way, where people aren't, and sometimes you can't see what you're being stressed, why you're stressing. Like, for example, buying something that you don't necessarily need, but you're working really hard towards that thing, and it's giving you a level of stress, but it's not a really obvious level of stress.
Yeah.
But the cortisol thing,
contextual.
Yeah. The cortisol like test obviously is great, but I think what you were saying earlier with the expectation fulfillment theory of dream, it's like everyone who I know who's stressed struggles. Like sleep is telling us when we're not able to sleep, we're not able to sleep throughout the night and feel rested in the morning. That straight away is telling you, right, you're stressed. That's all you need to know.
That's all you need to know. Yeah.
And especially for me, again, anecdotally, I spend a lot of time when I'm stressed in REM sleep. I know I do, because I often wake up afterwards and I try to write my dreams down if I can. But loads of other people I know who are stressed are like, I'm dreaming loads and blah, blah, blah. So the body's just already got all of its indicators there to be
Exactly. So how much qualitatively you can assess your stress, or how quantitatively you can assess your stress, really. And the cortisol is a very, very interesting molecule. But there's not only cortisol, there's DHEA, there's melatonin, there's all sorts of things, because mostly, so we need to remember a bit about humoral mediated immune system and the cellular mediated immune system, really. So that's quite an important thing. Humoral mediated immune system and cellular mediated immune system. So
one,
asthma, eczema, atopic dermatitis, eczema, psoriasis tend to be humoral mediated. No, psoriasis, sorry. Asthma and eczema are going to be humoral mediated.
How do you spell that?
Humoral. Humoral mediated immunity.
And is that related to hormones? Is that why?
No, it's just the process.
Okay.
It's just the process of the immune system, which is humorally mediated.
And mediated by macromolecules found in extracellular fluids such as secreted antibodies, complement proteins, and certain antimicrobial peptides. Humoral immunity is also named because it involves substances found in the humors or body fluid.
That's it. So all the immunoglobulins and those kind of things, that's gonna be mediated mostly by cortisol. And DHEA, another hormone produced by the cortex of the adrenal gland, is gonna actually mediate the cellular. Is going to actually modulate the cellular mediated immunity, okay, which is a bit more an autoimmune type situation, basically. Okay? So it's becoming it becomes quite interesting, really.
There's already two types of
substances are helping your body when in a critical situation and an acute situation to prevent your inflammation and your immune system from completely devouring your body, basically. Because once you cut yourself, the saber-toothed lion has taken part of your IT band out, and you've got a nasty gash on the wallet and thing. You have to lick your wounds, and you've got potential for infection. So you got like all the inflammation that is happening, and it's called diapedesis. So we've got like a swelling of the tissue, which actually helps to ooze out a lot of macrophage, a lot of the humoral mediated and cellular mediated immune system to actually get rid of bacteria and all sorts of things that have contaminated the wound, and to start the healing process. So all the platelets are coming, and they start to be a bit like the scab that is getting formed. There's all the rest and thing, and the wound tends to close itself. But if you don't have enough cortisol or DHEA, you tend to actually keep a wound like ulcerations, all those kind of stuff tend to be a problem with your cortisol, basically, or your stress level, basically. And that stress level, it can be environmental, it can be digestive, it can be hormonal, it can be emotional, it can be mechanical. Remember, we said osteopathy was osteon, not osteo, but osteon. The Greek derivative was the root of things, the bare bone of things. Okay, in that meaning, rather than the bone itself, like the skeleton.
Just the bone, yeah.
Not the chiropractor or the physio or the doctor, they got like pieces of plastic representing the skeleton, really. Okay, it's not that. It's osteopathy is pathology having its root in a musculoskeletal imbalance, basically. Okay, so we think as osteopaths that we talk about tensegrity, we talk about the torque there is, the mechanical torque there is, which is going to work on the intracellular fluid and the intracellular matrix and things like that. The cell is not going to be working in an optimum fashion when it's mechanically distorted, basically.
And also because of nutrients getting to it.
And so, and then pH, and we talk about acidic type environment, all those kind of stuff and things, really, okay? Well, actually, the pH in the body doesn't vary at all, but it's a buffer. So when we do a bit of chemistry, you get a buffer, and you can add loads of acid and loads of alkaline, and it doesn't really change the pH, okay? And so we talk about, the oranges and the citrus is really acidic. It's like, well, no, because the citric acid is actually a weak acid, and actually is going to buffer even more the whole lot, which actually is going to stabilize your pH quite nicely, really. Sugar would be much more acidic because you have protons, you've got exchange of protons, all those kind of stuff. So you're going to secrete even more acid in your stomach, and protons are going to lead to HCl, and HCl is a strong acid. Hydrochloric acid, really. Okay, so there's so much in terms of the stress like that, which is like it's a minefield. It's a minefield. But if you do a bit of so if you look a bit at your diet, at your dietary habit, maybe, and your way of cooking, and the type of diet you suit best. So it's a bit trial and error. I'm not too sure. There's loads of interesting things like paleo diet, like keto diet, like raw food, like juicing, like all sorts of things. But it needs to be something you can carry on throughout life in a way, really.
Yeah, I think with the diet, it's almost like I spent this weekend with a lot of my friends who are vegans, and to me, I feel like any diet's probably quite good if it's a well-known diet. If it's a famous diet, it's probably not that bad for you. Obviously there's going to be some horror stories, but there's so many other factors at play, it's nearly impossible to say
to attribute it to the one thing.
So it's like just pick a diet that you can stick with.
I don't think we must not be, because we all diet, because we all eat.
I guess I'm using the word diet as a a way of eating.
A way of eating,
So a framework behind how you eat.
But we can see that some substances, so the way of eating of Japanese people had changed quite drastically over the last few decades, and we see much more breast cancer, we see much more problem of the sort in Japan, for example. So, and I think the diet has been westernized a little bit, trans fats, all those kind of stuff and things, which compared to the way their body was possibly used to having that thing,
because that's what a lot of the people
rice rather than wheat and all those kind of stuff.
On a carnivore diet, because I've read about it quite a lot because I'm very interested in conspiracy, and because it's like the start of echo chamber, almost like a religion or a cult kind of thing, but also I'm interested in nutrition, and I don't think meat is bad like so many people have said. But within the carnivore diet, so many of them have said that they've traced back their ancestry, and for whatever reason, I think Jordan Peterson said a similar thing, for whatever reason they would have like hunted meats from till quite late, and so like their body's quite fine with meat, but then other people, for example, can't. They have meat and they know it straight away.
We see Inuits, for example, like people in the north, close to the pole in northern Canada or Russia, tend to, well, they don't have broccoli much growing. I don't think they even got a name for, they don't even have a word for green, but I think they've got like 20 or 30 words for white. Because of course, anyway, so there's not many broccolis and oranges growing there, and they've got mostly a very high animal fat diet, and they've got very, very little triglycerides. They've got very little cholesterol, basically. But on the BBC, they were talking about that tribe in South America of people who were actually running, and in Mexico somewhere, and then all of a sudden they are in their old way of actually living and activating themselves and all those kind of stuff, and the type of diet and the dietary habit and the type of foods they were eating was actually suiting them. They are very lean people, very athletic, they are like running at 3,000 meters in altitude, no problem. Tac. They've got like festivals every year where they go running and sing, and they are some of the most obese and the way their metabolism completely changes as soon as they go into cities and they get more sedentary, and they tend to have sugars really, and they've got high incidence of diabetes, high incidence of heart attack and strokes and all the rest really. So their genetic makeup is actually well suited for a type of activity, physical activity, and a type of the foods basically, and that's quite big. That's quite a huge thing really. There's loads of anecdotal evidence that certain like ancestral ways tend to actually suit people quite well, and as soon as they get out of that kind of way, well, the whole thing goes belly up really a bit really.
Yeah, and part of the issue of that is because we have obviously supermarkets that have absolutely everything in them, no matter what season, and so you can eat whatever you want whenever you want, and so much of that is processed and not natural food anyway.
Yeah, there's loads. I don't know, eggplants and tomatoes and potatoes are of the family of the Solanaceae, so like a deadly nightshade and datura. It's not really the best type thing. Potatoes, if they're a bit green, they tend to be quite alkalinizing. They tend to be quite acidifying for your internal environment. They tend to be pro-inflammatory, all those kind of stuff for your gut, all those kind of stuff really, in a way really. So certain foods. But if you go to Greece and it's August and you have the local moussaka, you're gonna have eggplants. You're gonna have grown there. It's quite seasonal, all those kind of stuff. And as long as you don't eat eggplants every day, the whole lot, it's not gonna really be a problem, really. But if you eat potatoes, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, day in, day out, there's a bit of a problem, really. That's where the whole thing becomes really a bit of a problem.
Too much of the same thing. Everything in moderation, including moderation.
That's it. We have to be a bit, well, I don't know, like it's all that, where do we put the stress, where do we put the, which of the stresses are the one you have to address in your life, really, in a way. But I guess people need to be given a bit of a framework again, that's the whole thing, really, to be able to make better decisions to improve their health and their response to stress and their, that's it, really. I think that's really an important thing.
What advice would you give to someone who is stressed? If they know that they're stressed or they're...
when they know they are stressed, I think it's quite an important thing. I think it's not to stress people by telling them that they're actually stressed and they don't know they're stressed, because I think that's quite
stressful.
It's quite stressful in a way, really. And I don't know, like advice-wise, I think it's really to...
How would you work through, like where is your stress coming from? Because like it seems to me that stress is one of the top. It's like the first thing to deal with for me. It's like if you've got IBS or if you're in pain or if you're in this, blah 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 blah. Might be a good idea to.
So that's the context again. So trying to deal with IBS when you've got IBS might not be the best way to deal with IBS.
Trying to deal with IBS when you've got IBS might not be the best way to deal with IBS.
Exactly. Yeah.
So how do you do that then?
So you need to look at stress, and I think your whole environment, your response to your environment. I don't know, like you're coming back home. There's people dealing drugs in your case when you go back to the flight and all those kind of stuff and thing. That's really stressful. There's like a gun crime or like, I don't know, like knife crime or those kind of stuff. That's going to be quite a stressful environment, really. So that's going to play onto things, really. The type of work you're doing, all those kind of things, really. Like the people at work, if your boss is really bullying you, or all the rest and thing, I don't know, like your colleagues or thing, the commuting you have to do, all the rest.
Just really. Try
to really dissect a bit every part, really, and what is possible to change. Because obviously, if you got plantar fasciitis because you stand a lot and you work in a bakery and you're there day in day out, 7 or 8 hours a day, and you're standing and you're not doing too much of a lot, we're not gonna tell you stop working in the bloody thing. Put your feet up, have some pina coladas on the house, something like that, really. The job is actually providing you with quite a lot, really. So there are things that can be changed and others that can't. Really, very realistically, really. So I think it's to really assess the whole lot. We talked about that with Jordan Peterson a little bit, about clean your room, really. Clean your room. Like do something. Global warming is great, and stress is great to know that it's there, really. But sometimes it's just the smallest changes that are actually making the biggest impact, really.
It's definitely the biggest impact that you can see in your life.
In your life, exactly.
It's like that's a really big thing.
That's it.
To do. Then if you're able to do that on autopilot every single day,
that's it.
Then you can bite.
I tend to talk to my patient quite a lot when they are in pain and things like that. I tend to tell them they are very good at being in pain. They are really excellent at being in pain. They've really rehearsed it really to the nth level, really, and they are excellent at it. They are really great people. They are great at being in pain.
What's that?
And people chuckle a bit really because they know they are quite good at being in pain because it's pretty obvious really. But the whole thing is the whole process at play is difficult to isolate really, and that's why we talk about the pain gate. That's why we talk about the human given. That's why we talk about environmental stuff. That's why we talk about all sorts of things really. So the allopathic medicine and thing. Patient who's got low back pain, and yes, it transpires that she's got this groin pain, or her upper lumbar spine is really uncomfortable, or neck is uncomfortable, certain time of the month is getting worse at times, all those kind of stuff. That's really, she's on a contraceptive, but it's not really for contraception, but it's for managing her period. Of course, she's got lots of bleeding, therefore she doesn't have enough iron, because she loses quite a lot of blood every month. All those kind of stuff. Where do you start really? And she's got bad back really, in a way really. So she comes to me for a bad back, but it's all to do with that really. So taking the pill is a really interesting thing to be able to manage a bit the whole lot. Maybe is to look at sesame seeds and spirulina and steak and liver, all those kind of stuff to get lots of iron in your diet. There's like all the iron supplements possible. So there's a tablet one which can constipate you. There's the liquid ones like going to be better a little bit. So the amount of exercise she's doing, how sedentary she is, all those kind of stuff, breathing exercises in order to massage the whole lot. So you need to really work at the whole lot. And then the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. That's the whole stuff really. The skin and the central nervous system.
Is the ectoderm?
Ectoderm, skin and central nervous system. The mesoderm is the connective tissue, the joint and the muscle, and endoderm is the gut. So she's having the contraceptive pill to look at her gut really, but she can do breathing because of for her gut, and her musculoskeletal system. She could do some stretching for the proper stuff for her sacroiliac, but for the musculoskeletal system and her gut, she could do some walking a little bit in between. I don't know, at lunchtime, all those kind of stuff.
So she's taking the pill for, did you say for her gut or for...
No, that's it, for your organs.
For organs, yeah.
For her uterus.
Yeah.
For the dysmenorrhea she's suffering from, really, in a way, really, to mitigate a little bit her
but
cycle.
Potentially she might be able to modulate the pain a little bit or mitigate the cycle by doing some walking or doing
on top of the whole thing. So the pill is great and is to keep it because it's helping internally at the moment and it's a great crutch about the whole lot. But if she looks at her central nervous system and the stress she's under, and maybe using a TENS machine to use the skin, or some foam rolling, or some massage, or cupping, or other modalities to use in relation to the sacroiliac and Woolgani organ a little bit, and the dermatome, all those kind of stuff. You can do quite a lot really, and then the stretches of her hip flexors, or quadriceps, or her QL, the whole lot and things. There's walking, there's breathing exercises, and all of a sudden the problem is TENS machine, I've got one somewhere, I have to dig it out. So she had actually people are really competent, but it's not organized. So she has been suffering from that problem for a long time, but she's not really integrated it, and she didn't quite know why she was using a TENS machine.
It's because it's quite easy to get emotional about an issue and then not think straight.
But that's it. You can't see the tree from the forest, really. So I would say for people who've got a bit of stress, I would advise them to find a good framework around the pain gate is that neurophysiological process, and the expectation fulfillment theory of dream is great. All the diets, all this kind of stuff, whatever you want to do, you do. You get into, as long as you get control, as long as you get more competent, as long as you get like all the, I don't know, like I was looking at type of yoga, and then the lady is doing a 7-week program, and a 7-week program, and one of the perks was the fact that it's part of the community, because everybody's on Facebook and they've got a community type thing, and everybody talks about how shit they feel and how great they feel and how really well put together their poo is in the morning, all the rest and thing, which is great really. So you can tick some of the boxes quite nicely again really.
Yeah, tick some of your emotional needs. But the other thing, which I only thought of when you were talking, is like probably the most important thing if someone's stressed or is trying to put together something within their life. It's like, I love the thing of accepting responsibility. So like accepting responsibility in absolutely everything, and therefore every ailment you've got, or every, you feel bad about this, or you're not able to hold yourself together at certain situations. Like if you're able to try and accept that you need to find out what works for you.
That's it. Like, I think you're there already, really. I think that's the whole thing, really.
Yeah.
Don't rely on others too much to do the jobs that need to be done by you, really, in a way, really. But at times it's great to get some help. A little bit as well, so that people who are depressed, antidepressant for most people who are depressed is the best thing they can do really in order for them to be able to function a little bit, and then you can do the stuff. If you're at the bottom of the pit, you're not going to be able to think very clearly, and therefore the program and the rule framework and the slight implementation you need to put through are going to look like they are completely impossible to do really. So sometimes we need help. We need others to maybe give us a hand a little bit, really. We are gregarious. We need others. Really.
Accepting the responsibility of trying to figure things out for yourself doesn't necessarily have to mean that you can't have help. It's like that you always need.
No. I was not talking about having help. I was talking about delegating the whole responsibility to somebody else. Because sometimes that can be people think they're getting help a little bit, really, in a way.
That's what I was getting to, like accepting the responsibility of you making the changes, or you trying to find out, and you trying to make the changes in your life that are going to affect you, isn't the same as not getting help. So you can get help so long as you don't expect someone else to do all the things for you. You need to get help
to maybe get the information, the proper framework, the competence,
or a bit of encouragement to do the right things.
Exactly. Acknowledgement that you're doing the whole lot, so a bit of reward, part of it, all those kind of stuff, a bit really. The internal locus of focus and the external locus of focus. Really quite important thing, really. We all have a responsibility to get our shit together a little bit more. Or we've got a responsibility and a duty to ourselves to actually try at least to get the whole ball rolling. Individually.
To be better today than you were yesterday.
Yeah, a little bit better today than you were yesterday. And if you manage to do that, and you go at it for the next 15 years, every day, well, you're going to be quite good at solving problems, and you're going to be quite good at understanding the stuff. And you might be able to share that with your neighbor, who, if he or she is in that process, might actually be helping you to go in that process, and you might actually help them. And all of a sudden, it's your community. You can do that too in your village, or all the rest and thing. And then once your village, it's your region type thing, and then the region, and then a whole lot, and then it's a freaking planet. Really, that's the whole stuff, really, and that becomes quite an interesting thing, really. But it cannot happen next week, and as much as a couple of autistic people and Asperger's people have actually been put in the media a little bit forward to champion the whole thing, which actually the whole global warming and the whole thing, it's great, really, but and it might actually appeal to the pretty catastic politicians that we have around, really, so it might be the right way of going about it, really. But as long as individually thing is not taken care of and people don't take responsibility individually, it's
still going to be an uphill struggle.
That's completely. But that's what it's on about, really. It's always an uphill struggle, really. It's called the survival of the fittest, really, and the survival of the least stressed, and the least stressed the longest. And the least stressed the longest is going to live the longer. That's the whole thing, really. And if he lives the longer, he might be able to influence the most people. And the most people being influenced might be the least stressed for the longest, which might... and it snowballs like that, really, you know? And people who are too stressed and yes, it's a cruel world out there, really. Nature is a bitch, really. Nature is out there to eat you, really.
It always has been.
And always will, really. And as much as we want Mother Nature to be really cuddly and nice, and the little foxy is really cute, and you send your kids with little sausages to feed the fox in your garden, and the kid gets mauled, really, because the fox is a carnivorous thing, and your child has got 10 little sausages. Once the sausage he was giving is already gone, really. So that's it, that's 2 fingers gone, really, because the fox is nice. But he's gonna get you, really, if he can. Because that's how it works. And I think that's a bit the tricky part, really. It's not fair, and it's a nasty environment.
But that's again why I think it's so liberating or just like freeing to accept that it's your fault. Like your responsibility for everything that you for not everything that you experience, but a lot of stuff that you experience. Mm-hmm. Because when you've done something wrong and you didn't realise it, then you realise it, then you apologise for doing something wrong to someone else.
Or to yourself as well.
It feels incredible.
Yeah.
And when you do that to yourself on a daily basis, it also, it's like all of a sudden you're not right brain emotional about it and stuck just being emotional about it. All of a sudden you can start thinking about things a little bit clearly.
We are all stuck one way or another about loads of things, really. That's great. That's a great thing, really. So that's a bit humbling as well, to know that that there is quite a lot of work to be done, and that it's a work in progress, and you can't get it right all the time, and you're quite limited in scope of what you can do, and knowing quite a lot is maybe sometimes not the best thing in a way, because it doesn't help you a little bit, really. So I don't know, like it's like really a great way of looking at it and taking responsibility for your own actions. I can't remember, like a long time ago, we were reading, my friend Vince and I, or Vince put me onto that actually, Vincent Louis, really great osteopath. He was talking about the 4 agreements. So it's like a Toltec philosophy, shamanic philosophy type thing. So there's 4 agreements. And it's like a nice little book from Manuel Don Ruiz or something like that. Manuel Don Ruiz, 4 agreements. Manuel Don Ruiz.
How's that spelled?
R-U-I-S.
Don
Manuel Ruiz.
Is it 4 agreements?
4 agreements, yeah.
Don Miguel Ruiz.
Don Miguel Ruiz, yeah, that's it, the 4 agreements. That's really quite an interesting little thing. So I think there was like always remember 3 or something of the whole lot. So I think there was like be impeccable with your word.
Yeah.
Always do.
Why?
Always do your best, and do not take things personally. And there must be
don't make assumptions.
And don't make assumptions. That's it. That's the last one.
Why? So I've heard the be impeccable with your word, and I used to lie quite a lot. And from someone who has realised that lying has a lot of really bad consequences, not only when you're doing it and after you've admitted to the lie, but afterwards for a long period of time. I know that it's important, but I don't quite. It's like what level? I talk a lot, and sometimes I go on a ramble, and then I'll say something that isn't constructed the right way, so it's not received the way that I say something that I don't mean. Mm-hmm. So it's like I understand why it's important, but why?
Mm-hmm. Well, we mentioned a bit with logos, logos is that intelligible word, really. You're creating, you're transforming even better, you're transforming your reality now using your word really. And if you talk nastily, and if you distort reality with your word about others, you distort reality about yourself really. Because if you talk badly about others, which is not the case, and if it's a false thing, actually you end up talking badly about yourself really, in a way really. So your reality changes. We talk about that's Genesis a little bit. It's how like God uses his word a little bit, is the intelligible word, the logos, basically, to bring light out of darkness. So there's all the creationist a little bit. He seems to create things. He creates man and things, but actually doesn't create it at all. He just transforms the inanimate clay into a living and thinking thing using his word, really, in a way, really. He doesn't create light. He just brings light out of darkness using his word. All the rest, really. He doesn't really. He just transforms what is already there, and he makes it, and he thinks it's good as well, and it looks and it's good. Basically, it's nice. It feels nice.
And that's a logos.
A logos, really. So that's maybe one of the stuff, and it's archetypal. So it's like a Toltec philosophy in a way, really. And the Toltecs are like an ancient Central American civilization, really, in a way, really. And they were talking about being impeccable with your word. So all those stuff have come out of the like millennia and millions of years of evolution, really. Because that's the way the whole thing goes, really. And you have to be impeccable with your word. Do not take anything personally. Don't make things personal, really. So when somebody says that you're really crap at the whole lot, is maybe right, and you can maybe think is right, or maybe it's his problem, really. He's really pointing at you for his shortfalls, really, a little bit, really. That's the whole thing, really.
That's another really interesting one, because I follow a guy called Gary Vaynerchuk, who's an American entrepreneur. He's like he was from the Soviet Union and moved there when he was quite young, and he feels very blessed that his family worked very hard, and he never wanted for anything or needed anything, and he's always worked really hard. Now he's massively wealthy and quite famous on social media and stuff, and he always talks about not expecting anything from anyone ever, and not and that's linked in with the one that's sort of more closely related to don't take anything personally, is not caring what anyone thinks of you, like at all. So like, don't expect anything from anyone else, and don't care what anyone thinks of you. And I've never heard anyone. And he was like, you can separate that from trust. You can separate that from love. You can trust someone and love someone and have a great relationship, but you can separate them caring about what they think of you, so long as you don't ever do anything.
People love you because of the love you put into the whole thing, really. So it's not, the love doesn't come to you just as a freebie, really. The love is because of the love you give the love you receive is because of the love you give, really, in a way, really. The energy you put into your relationship is received by an energy that is put into the relationship. So the other person is going to be as active as you in a whole lot, really. And if you are surrounded by people who you invest yourself quite a lot and they don't, well, obviously they are not the right people, really. So you need to maybe surround yourself with people who there's a bit of a reciprocal type stuff at times, not all the time maybe, but at times, really. And all of a sudden that feeds the whole lot, and maybe it's about making assumptions, really. You assume that other people are going to be thinking great thing about you or bad thing about you, when actually it's completely distorted, really. You need to ask them, really.
And both of these, so that don't take anything personally and that don't make assumptions, you can so very quickly fall completely
right brain
Of
and
course.
get very, very emotional about those
and worried
and worried
and make a little castle in Spain, become a bit like Don Quixote, a little bit really. You get a bit, no doubt. I was as a therapist like that. I was really thinking a bit. I was trying to make. I was talking about attention a little bit, because you have to give and receive attention. And when I treat patients, I always think I actually command quite a lot of attention from them. I command a lot of attention. I talk quite a lot. I want to let them know about the framework that I'm using. I want to get them to get to the jig about the whole lot. And actually, when asked, people actually think that they are given quite a lot of attention by actually being described and putting their contextualizing a bit their problem into that framework. They really, most patients will say that they are actually thinking they receive quite a lot of attention, when actually I think I'm taking quite a lot of attention. So I make an assumption that, and I get warped in my way of looking about the whole thing.
But attention isn't just so them talk. You ask a patient comes in and you're asking them lots of questions, getting them thinking and blah blah
Of course.
But you're giving them a lot of attention as well, because you're listening to what they're saying.
I listen to what they're saying,
engaged.
exactly. But I tend to speak quite a lot to them as well, because there's quite a lot to cover about stretches, about the whole lot, about what is it that makes them tick in a way, really. So if the person is like, I want to have stretches, I'm like, well, have you done any sports before? Have you stretched before? No. Well, let's not. What is it you've done before? If you haven't done stretches, I've been doing some yoga. Okay, great. Well, or I've been doing some meditation. Okay, well, let's talk about meditation, because that's what you're going to be good at doing, really. We're not going to teach you how to do... Anyway, let's not rant about the whole lot, but it's quite an interesting thing about the assumption
And then
type thing, really. Always do your best.
why? For those people who would be like, what's the point? Well, there's no meaning.
Yes, that's it. Well, for those people, it's great. It's... I think Jordan Peterson was talking about the whole lot like that. He said, well, if you think there's no meaning and there's no stuff, what is it? And if you believe that, what is it what is that belief allowing you not to believe in? That's the whole thing, really. So that's the whole stuff, really. What is it you're hiding, really? How much of a white lie is what you just said, really? Why is it you're saying it, really? Why is it that it needs to be, I think it's just because it's when God transformed darkness into light, and he looked at it, he thought it was good, really. And because we know what is good and what is bad. Intrinsically, you know why. Unless you're brain damaged, and then you don't.Maybe potentially.
Do you think you could get so contextually blind by years of just, I guess a bit of abuse in various ways, and just being so unbelievably stuck in right or left side of your brain, and truly believe that there is no, and truly not be able to know the difference between good and bad?
Yeah, well, it's because you're too aroused, and therefore I don't think you can. My idea of it. Yeah, you can be in a position. I believe you can be in a position where you don't know what's good and what's bad. Otherwise, you would not murder people. That's the whole thing, really.
At that moment, yeah.
At that moment,
but not permanently over time.
Over time, when you're in prison and you've mulled over it for 25 years, you've got a good idea that, well, the result about the action and was really not very good, really. And therefore your life has completely taken a different turn in light of how potentially bad what you've just done was, really. And society is just there to remind you that there's no line to cross at times, really. But most of us don't cross it. The majority of us don't cross it. That's the whole thing, really. Because we know mostly what's good and what's bad, really. Intrinsically in our DNA, it's a bit bizarre, it's a bit weird, really. Thinking of that, really. There's there's that propension in all of us to actually know right from wrong, and the dominance hierarchy and the pattern of behavior and all those kind of stuff, and then you put rules into it really. Piaget and how Peterson describes the whole lot a bit about the kids playing really, and the kids play, and then you got like 4 or 5 or 3-year-olds, and then they're all playing, all the little cousins meet and things. I've seen that in my family as well, huh? All the cousins play and things like that. My kids don't speak much French, and their cousins speak quite a lot of French, but they don't speak much English, and everybody plays. They don't even speak the same language, and they play really. Haven't the kids play really well today and things like that? So, yeah, it's a bit weird, really. How come they manage? And as an adult, you want to get a rule, really. But the way the kids, because they're quite so spontaneous, the way their body is and the way they act on a whole lot, they end up the whole pattern of behavior makes that they're actually working quite well, really. And when one crosses the line, all the others gang on him, really, or on her, really, in order to put the whole thing back in line, really. Or they come to see the adults and all the rest, really. But
does that link in at all with being precise with your speech at all? Because it's like, almost seems to me like kids are able to run like their little community or their little game or whatever quite well, and then
until one crosses the line, and then all the others are is getting sidelined from the whole lot, really, because obviously he hasn't followed the rule, but it's an unspoken rule. There's no need to have a rule. A rule is just intellectualization of the pattern of behavior, really. We are just, and it doesn't help in a way, because it's just there. It's how it is. That's why it resonates with you, really. He talks about the whole lot. Peterson talks about the whole lot when Moses has had an earful of the Jews for the last 40 years in the desert, and they are bickering and all day long and sing. And then he goes on the top of the mountain and he carves the whole lot, and he says, okay, now that's the rules, really. And everybody's like, oh, wow, yeah, great. Oh, brilliant. Oh, yeah, that works so well. And why would the rules work so well? Why would you follow the rules? Because they are intrinsically part of you, really. So
everyone agrees with them. Even now, everyone always says.
Everyone agrees still about the whole lot. Do not do to others what you don't want them to do to you, really. Don't kill people. Don't kill your neighbor. Why? 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 So the wolf, the dominant wolf, is knows that if he kills all the dominated one, he doesn't have a pack, and if he doesn't have a pack, he doesn't survive, really. So you do not kill the dominated one. Even the minions must not be killed, because they have something to teach us. They have a part to play in the whole thing, really. How dare you take somebody's life when actually that person could have changed the world, really? That's the whole thing, really. That's what gets reprimanded. That's the whole stuff, really. And that's why we don't kill people. That's why the death penalty doesn't work, really. And that's why we don't kill people for having killed somebody, really. Because otherwise, it completely defeats the purpose, really. It's completely stupid to kill somebody for having killed somebody. It's like an eye for an eye. Well, great, brilliant, really. But that murderer, if he really comes to his senses and he sees the whole lot, maybe if he redeems himself and he forgives himself for having done the unspeakable, maybe he can pass that on to others, really, and change the whole lot, really. And if he changes two people and himself, well, it was like the lives that have been lost for the right reason, really. So all the whole stuff about forgiveness and things like that is really, really important, really, you know. And I don't know, and it's easy to say when you're not emotionally aroused because that person hasn't raped and killed your kid, really, in a way, really. That's the whole stuff, really. and it's easy for maybe me to say really about the whole lot. It's
Of
much
course
harder for the person who is in a full brunt of having lost a loved one from an unspeakable act really, and from somebody who's done an unspeakable act really. But as humanity, as a human, if we were to be able to think about those kind of stuff like that, well, all of a sudden, you do not kill somebody who killed somebody. That's the whole thing, really. Even if it's there'll be less people in prisons. We can see the rehabilitation and the reintegration of detainees is not super good. The whole, they don't seem to change. It's like a bit like a crime school, really, to go to prison, really. So if we were to shoot everybody who are condemned by the court and things like that, there'd be no prison. We won't have to pay for the whole lot. Part of our tax would not go onto that. There'll be no resources spent, but we lose all those people, which are that's the whole thing, really. So maybe the way society goes about it, we should put them a bit more forward, really. They should be a bit more useful, really.
Well, those people.
Yeah, people who've murderers, really. Murderers might be a bit more useful than we think they might be, really. Potentially, really. That's the thing, really. How does it work, really? How do we go about doing it, really? Otherwise, we shoot everybody, and then we clear the prisons, we make some student accommodation in it, and that's perfect, really. That works really well, really. And then the state doesn't have to be accountable and things like that, really.
No, but there's too much money in prisons.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of employment, there's quite a lot of things, but we can see the dead end it is a bit, really, at the moment, and the way it's done, really.
The prison system in Norway is really, really successful. And one of their prisons, in fact the prison, I think the main prison in Oslo, is just outside or just over the fjords on an island. Yeah. And you look at it, it's really strange because they were all allowed just to walk around freely. Because obviously it's not a very easy place to escape from.
Yes, that's it.
And they have the highest, I think I'm right in saying that they have the highest retention rate of people staying out of prison.
Yeah. But people who go to prison in those prisons tend to cook for themselves, they tend to make their beds, they tend to clean the communal areas, they tend to engage with other inmates, they tend to have the opportunity to learn a trade, they tend to be able to, they need to do therapy, all those kind of stuff, really. They need to be clear of substances, all those kind of stuff. So it's a very heavy burden for society to have to pay for those kind of stuff, really. But it makes for better rounded people, and therefore the rate of
recidivism.
That's quite French.
Recidivism.
Latin.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, the 4 agreements, really an interesting little thing. Little book. So there's plenty like that, and it's
Toltec wisdom.
Yeah, Toltec. Is it Toltec? Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting.
It says here at the end of this little article, says that they mention that Ruiz' next book, The Fifth Agreement, suggests the following agreement: be skeptical but learn to listen.
Yes, that's it. You need to listen to others. They might have something really important to teach you all the time, really. And to be able to even take part in groups that are not really your friends. I think that's quite an important thing, really, where you can really be opening to the ideas of others that are not your ideas and that you don't share. Because by actually being able to be explained they are rational, maybe you can really see things from a bit of a different angle, really.
And it puts you in a position where you get comfortable outside of the comfort of tribalism. So like when I hang out with certain friends, I'm unbelievably comfortable.
Yeah.
and I'm trying to learn more just to be comfortable and not care about what anyone else thinks or not make any assumptions around people that put me in a state where I care way too much or more or whatever.
Of course.
And so then you're able, if you're not backed up by the feelings and the arousal that comes with tribalism, and you're able to converse with them, then there's a real discussion.
Yeah, I think that the whole thing with nationalism, a bit like the push of the far right a little bit at the moment, there is really, which actually a lot of people talk about racism and things like that, but I guess you talk about tribalism, but I think it's a culturalism in a way. How good are you in your hijab and your full veil at communicating with others in your community, your point of view about your religious belief, your everyday beliefs, all those kind of stuff. If you're not able to speak the language, or if you're not able to speak to men, all those kind of stuff. How is it that you can bridge the gap there is between your culture and the culture of the people you live with, really? If you're quite obviously a little bit different, really. That's a bit the problem, really. So you go to immigration policies in New Zealand, you come to the country, you don't speak English, they tell you to come back when you do, really. Not to say to tell you to fuck off, really. Don't speak English, well, come back when you do, mate. No problem. Bye. Like, how is it you can live in a country and not speak the language? How is it you're going to be able to bridge the gap there is between your culture, your way of thinking, and the way of thinking of people around you?
Cultural integration.
There's culturalism, that's the whole main problem, and you come, you speak English, and your wife and your kids come, and the kids get scholarized and they end up speaking very good, but your wife is not speaking English at all, really. And that's a big problem, really. Because being part of a community is really good. Having meaningful relationship with other people is really good, really. And we are quite open to a lot of different ways and different cultural differences, really. But there's a couple of things that we should not have to put up with, really. And people not speaking the lingo is the first one, really. You don't speak the lingo, well, go back to where you speak the lingo, because that's going to be the best place where you can live, really, with others, really. And it's not nasty, huh? It's just like, you want to live with us, you need to speak the language we speak, really, in order for us to be able to listen to the differences we have between each other, because I need to understand and I need to know how different you are to me, really. Because it's great to be different to me, because that's what it's all about, really. And that if we can bridge that difference, and even if I don't accept the difference, like, it doesn't matter, really, because I know what is it I'm different from you about, really. That's the whole lot. Is a whole alien type thing, really, you know.
Yeah, and it's not up to the individual to accept or to not accept on the whole, is it?
On the whole, exactly. It's to understand.
Yeah.
It's to get an idea about the whole lot and to be able to have understood a little bit. And we see a bit, we've got a little bit of a problem with Islam. Not many people know what a Shiite and a Sunni is. Talk to them about Sufis, and you talk to them about what the Sharia is, you talk to them about the 5 pillars of Islam, all the rest, and things. People are a bit like, well, yeah, it's not all the Arabs. Well, yeah, no, Arabs and Muslims not the same. There's lots of Arabs, we are Christians. And they're not having a very good time at the moment. Really. Bizarrely, really. It's a bit bizarre. How many Christians are bombing mosques? Well, not too many, really. That's a bit weird, really. So, obviously, some minority in Islam are really quite violent, and they want to impose their view, really, with violence, really. When actually, you know, like in France, people who wear the chador, for example, girls who wear the chador, or Jews who wear the kappa, or there was a bit of a problem with Sikh people as well who wear their turban. Well, when you go to school in France, you cannot have any ostentatory religious accessories, basically. Because in 1789 we had the French Revolution and we split the state and the church. So the state school is a non-denominative, neutral environment. and a lot of Muslims in France have had a big hoo-ha. No. You want to, and then there's what everybody's, the French have been really a bit harsh on the Muslims and things like that. It's a bit like, well, no. In 1789, it's a while back, and we've done quite a fair bit. We've chopped a few heads. There was a terror, all those kind of stuff. It really fucked up people quite nicely, but we came up with a school way, a way of teaching people. And it's a free education, and it's quite broad education, but there's no religious ostentatory like accessories. That's it. You can't have your David cross, you can't have your cross, you can't have your kappa, you can't have your chador. Sorry. If you want to wear your chador, you can have a Quranic school, because it's France. We are open to all the ways possible. You want to be able to have education and wear your chador? No problem. There's absolutely no problem. Create your Quranic school, or create a Hebrew school, or create a Rastafari school. No problem. There's no problem. No problem. And that's a bit the whole glitcheries, really.
I think that's an interesting way of looking at it, because a lot of political people, or even just anyone commenting on any political issue, they don't divorce their moral or their religious beliefs from their government, or I guess like religion from their moral or state beliefs, like governmental beliefs. And I think that's quite dangerous, because it's not accepting of everyone, is it?
Yeah, that's it. And the bigotry it brings a little bit, really. And I don't know, maybe by saying that you have to speak the lingo when you come to the country and you want to live in it, is it really that extreme? That's a bit bizarre.
Either that, or I agree with that personally, but I don't know much about the issue, I guess, politically. But it's either that, or I feel like if we are going to accept people to come in to, let's say, England, or the UK or whatever, so if we're going to accept them in and they're not going to speak English, then we need to figure out a better way to integrate them. Rather than creating ghettos, which is what's been done in the past, isn't it?
Ghettoization, a bit. Yeah, very much so. Like the post-colonialistic type stuff in France as well with North Africans is a bit the same, really. There's a big problem nowadays, and the whole radicalization of those kids is really quite an easy task in a way, really, because they are a bit lost, and the government and the state and the environment they're in, and they're a bit more stressed. They're less successful at school. They've got less opportunities for work. There's all the whole lot, really, and they're not too sure whether they're North African or they're French, or their culture of their parents or their grandparents, and the culture of the state around and things like that. It's very conflicting, really, conflicted, basically. And but it's the responsibility of the person coming in the country as well. How is it you justify to yourself coming to a country as a political refugee because there's war, all those kind of stuff? How many Syrian people are asking for English lessons or French lessons or German lessons? in a way, really. We're not too sure. But we focus a lot on how much the state of Germany or France or the UK are actually providing English, French or German lessons to the Syrians. So that's the whole thing. It's going a bit two ways. Again, it's that state who's actually almighty and providing, and we wait for the state to do the stuff. Oh yeah, they don't do that Yeah, no, there's free library, mate. There's free library. There's internet connection in the library. You don't need one at home. You don't have to pay for it. It's gratis. And you've got an obligation to do, really. Well, you can see
to your community
obligation I've had to myself to actually speak the lingo, really. And it's not really... I don't speak the proper Queen's English, really, but I tend to be articulate enough, and we're able to have a meaningful conversation a bit about the whole lot, really, and that's not coming easily, really. It didn't happen like that, really. I had to work for it. I had to make mistakes. I had to be pointed at. It was quite interesting, really, learning another language, really.
But what age did you start learning?
I learned English in secondary school, at school, so like the grammar a bit, the whole lot. So I guess my written English is pretty academic in a way, really. But the colloquialisms and the whole fluency didn't happen until I was 28, and I came to live in the UK, really. And I went to the pub, and because I can drink alcohol, and I'm happy about drinking alcohol as well, and I played darts. I quite enjoy the whole culture and that part of the whole lot, and going after a bit of a boozing evening to the Indian restaurant and all the rest and stuff, and I had a girlfriend I could not call when she was watching EastEnders, all the rest, and think she was completely fanatical about that, all the rest, and think so, like all very British, very English way of doing, really, Sunday lunch and all the rest, and fingers up, all those kind of stuff, all the whole stuff, like why is it we drive on that side of the road, why all the rest, really. I think you get absorbed into the whole stuff a bit, really, and
if you allow yourself.
But if you got a duty as well to learn it as well, because that's the main thing, really, and that enables you to have a quite meaningful relationship with other people if you allow yourself to do it, really, and that's helping to be integrated, really. Well, I'm married to an English lady, and I've got kids who were born in the UK. And thing, really, so in Gloucester Hospital, so it's like who would have known, really. That's the thing, really. That's just how it went, really. Really. But that's interesting, really. Interesting.
Should we end it there?
Yeah, we can. The 4 agreements was a good way of finishing the whole thing, really.